Alright, disco, the end of the Vietnam War, and the fuel crunch. All major highlights of the 1970s. The person I chose to interview for this project was my father, who was born 8/9/1955. So he was 15, 1970, and lived through this as a teenager. Um, he grew up in Lombard, Illinois, went to high school down there. And he actually spent part of his late high school years in Japan for a cowboy stunt show. My dad, Rick LeFevour, I am Rick LeFevour Jr., was in his late teens, like I said, during the 1970s. He had a whole lot of great information to tell me about this generation and era. Some of the things we talked about were, like I said, the end of the Vietnam War, Saturday Night Fever, and that was the start of disco. So, and my dad and other people had their own versions of the 1970s. For my dad, it was about rodeo and high school and college. And for others, it was about drugs, disco, and dancing the night away. So, I chose two questions like we were supposed to. The first one I got into was what were some of the social, political, historical trends, events that me and my dad would have talked about. And how does the responses confirm, reject, or expand on the course readings? We know the rest of the question. Me and my dad discussed the fuel crunch of 1974 and 1975, which was basically this Saudi Arabia, where we get our oil, putting an embargo on us, which, excuse me, scared us. They made the United States believe that they weren't getting any more fuel. So, people freaked out. It caused people to rush to gas stations, fuel stations to fill up, even if they only had like a half tank of fuel, which caused this gas crunch because people literally did it to themselves. The fuel was there, but because people kept coming in so often for fuel, that stations ran out of fuel because people didn't necessarily need any of the fuel, but they thought every time they got down to a half tank, they had to refill. And and because of this, people started to sell their big American cars. This was right at the end of the muscle car era. So everything that had the big Hemis and 400 motors and whatnot, they started getting rid of these long, large cars and buying the Toyotas and foreign cars because they got better fuel mileage. And my dad said when he was in high school, one of his teachers actually got one of these cars. And to quote my dad, he said it looked like a barf green shoebox on wheels and sounded like a bunch of lug nuts in a blender when he started it. And to play a prank on him, because they were so small, him and all his high school friends decided to bounce on the bumper hard enough to cause the car to spin around in circles, move it from parking spots. Made the teacher freak out just a little bit. The other thing we talked a lot about was disco, and how Saturday Night Fever, the movie with John Travolta, is what kind of really started it all. Before that movie, it was people kind of knew what it was. It wasn't a huge deal until this movie came out. And my dad told me he was at Regis in 1976. And Regis is in Colorado. We all know this. That area was very country still. They still listen to a lot of old country music, and well, old to me anyway. To them, it was new country music, and music from the '60s. But all of a sudden, all the freshmen for the next semester started coming in, and they're all wearing these white suits with no buttons, no shirt on, all doing these dance moves. And my dad said, to quote my dad again, he said, "Me and my friends didn't know what the hell was going on, so we went and saw the Saturday Night Fever, and we thought it was the dumbest thing we'd ever seen." My dad was not into that whole scene very much, but it did make for some good stories that I will not mention because there's a little out there. They said that it was stupid clothing and even worse music, to quote my dad again. And this kind of reminded me of the clip we watched of John Travolta back in I think it was the Gender and Sexuality method lab. And how cool he made it look to do these moves and dance with the no shirt and the white suit. And my dad said most of the people of Colorado in that time didn't care for it even after the movie came out. There was a small number, but not like Chicago or Florida where it was huge, or even the East Coast. Um, so it's not as cool as Saturday Night Fever made it look, disco, that is. And John Travolta can dance all he wants, but I guess he'll never make Coloradoans like disco because even today we hate it, and I don't think it made a very big impression on us. Um, and then I had a second question, of course. So I said the question I chose was based on your interview. What are some biggest difference between growing up during that decade and growing up today? And what are some of the biggest similarities? Compare and contrast. Some of the biggest differences I've noticed between my generation and my dad's was that people were way more relaxed back then. Today we're all very tight and in a hurry. We never just kind of relax, and it also seems like we're very quick to take people to court over dumb things. I know this isn't very relevant, but my dad was talking about this back then. He would in the 1970s they get in bar fights and screw around, and police would let them go with a slap on the wrist, no problem. Bar fights, you got in a fight and you move on with your life. Now it seems like we get in these fights and people instantly want to get money out of it when it's just a stupid bar fight. Who cares? But that's different. But another thing I noticed that is completely the same is the news. Minus a few things which I'll get into in a second. But the news still controls how we see the world in a sense. Some people will listen to the news and take it word for word, which is way out of line. The news can control fear, can control what they want us to know. And I think that, and just like the gas crunch, that was caused by the news. No one knew about it until the news started talking about it, and that's when everybody freaked out. It's kind of like the swine flu today. The swine flu was this disease that the news blew out of proportion. It made it sound like everybody was dying because of it. It was only younger people, older people, people with respiratory issues. I had swine flu. I'm fine. It's just, people. The news just makes things scary for people. It's the fear factor, and they control what they want us to know and what they don't want us to know. Um, and But also a big thing in the 70s that changed with the news was women anchormen. Just like the movie Anchorman with Will Ferrell. Stupid movie, but somewhat true. My dad knew a woman in the 80s who was an anchor woman in the 70s. And the anchorman that was working there before, I think it was at NBC, hated her. Wouldn't talk to her, wouldn't look at her, wanted nothing to do with her. It's just like the movie Anchorman, minus all the comedy and dirty jokes, of course. The last thing that I kind of noticed that was a lot the same about my generation and my dad's is the way teens and young adults adapt to music. Um, to my dad, it was disco. To us, it's this dubstep, I guess you'd call it, or genres adapting or moving on to sound more cool, which is a term from the 70s, the word cool. Remember that. Um, but disco, not cool anymore, obviously. But his generation adapted to it and made it their own. It's just like rock and roll in the 80s or hip hop in the 90s, and everything's adapted. Rock and roll is not like the rock and roll of Nirvana or AC/DC or Aerosmith. It's this new stuff that's just kind of, it's not the same. And it's the same with country music. Country music now sounds like pop, rap, and rock and country all thrown into a ball, and just, it doesn't sound very good. Um, but it's true that what his dad loved, my dad didn't like, and what I love to listen to, my dad doesn't like. And it's funny how much music truly does make a difference in today's world. In conclusion, the 1970s was what sounded like one hell of a ride. From the end of the Vietnam War, America feeling down on itself because they've actually lost a war, felt like they lost a war, to the gas crunch, or from the news scaring people to disco and the new generations of music. Every decade has things that highlight it, and these things I've explained are just a few. My dad lived them and shared them with me, and he has his own opinions on them all. My dad wasn't a very in the know kind of person, but the stuff he did get to witness and be a part of, he wasn't a huge fan of. And from the words of my dad, the 1970s, excuse my language, but I'm quoting my dad. The 1970s was a shit show from the get-go, and I'm glad you didn't have to live in them. But sometimes I wish some things from the 1970s would carry into now, because the world now is even worse than it was back then. I agree and I disagree, but that's me and my dad. We butt heads about quite a bit of things. And to wrap it up, as they said in the 70s, grab your bunny, stay away from the man, and get down and chill. Check you later.